Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, yes, yeah. A warm good evening to you all, and a very bright good morning to Professor William Westerman, sir. Today is 5th September. Teachers' Day is celebrated all over India to commemorate the second president of independent India, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. On this auspicious day, I, on behalf of the Department of English, Sonapur College, welcome you all to this virtual platform for the international webinar on step toward decolonizing museums in a time of pandemic, violence, and other ills. The theme of the webinar is conceptualized after a series of discussion with our respected resource person, Sir William Westerman from New Jersey City University. Considering the need to look into the wealthy treasure of all the nations, it shows us the direction for rediscovering ourselves in this crucial juncture of the world during these pandemic times. The humdrum of day-to-day mechanical life pulls us away from the root. And especially the incessant lockdown period led man to look back upon their own treasures. After the finalization of the topic, we had a contact with the Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi. The Honorable VC Sir of the university has kindly consented for the association for the webinar. We have collaborated with the School for the Study of Culture and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences of the Central University. The Dean of both the schools, Dr. Rabindranath Sarma, also agreed to our request to grace the occasion as the keynote speaker. We offer our benign respect to their positive note. And today, here we are with all our respected participants from various colleges and universities of Assam, as well as from Central University of Jharkhand and its neighboring colleges. We also have students here. We all eagerly are waiting to listen to the great personalities on a timely, relevant topic. I once again welcome you all to the webinar of Sonapur College. Now I'd like to request the principal of our college, Dr. Devabrot Khanikor, sir, to offer his welcome address for the webinar. Over to principal, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Midusmita Mohanta. Good evening, everyone. Honorable Dr. Ratan Kumar D, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi, and the inaugurator of today's webinar. Keynote speaker, Dr. Rabindranath Sarma, Head, Department of Tribal Studies, Dean, School for the Study of Culture and School of Humanities and Social Science, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi. Honorable Research Person, Dr. William Westerman, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, New Jersey City University, USA. Respected professors from different higher education institutes from all over the country, Dr. Bipul Bora, Vice Principal of this college, dignitaries present today in the webinar, and my dear student participants. At the very outset, I, on behalf of Sonapur College fraternity, express our sincere appreciation to the School of Humanities and Social Science and School for the Study of Culture, Central University of Jharkhand for your kind association in organizing this webinar. At the very outset, I want to share a few words about Sonapur College. Sonapur College, located in Nessus Greenery on a hillock at Kamrup Metropolitan District, Assam, India, has been imparting bachelor's course in arts, commerce, and post-graduation. The University Grants Commission has approved Sonapur College as a DDU Kaushal Kendra for skill development and has been imparting bachelor's of vocation programs in retail management and IT, theater and stagecraft, and tourism and travel management. We are a National Assessment and Accreditation Council, in short, NAC accredited institute. We are also ranked by the National Institutional Ranking Framework, shortly NIRF. Recently, Sonapur College is ranked at 109 position among the arts colleges in the country in India Today, Best College Survey 2020. Approximately 1,400 students from different parts of the northeastern states have been pursuing their studies in the college in a congenial academic environment. A number of publications are published from the college every year, including a student's research journal. A consistent research and academic environment of the teachers, achievement of the teachers is commendable. The NCC and NSS activities, along with the social belongingness of the teachers, help to establish a strong societal fellowship. The rapid sweep of the coronavirus pandemic across the world has induced a considerable degree of fear, worry, and concern in the population at large. In public mental health terms, the main psychological impact to date is elevated rates of stress and anxiety. Proper care and maintenance of the COVID protocols is the foremost priority to keep ourselves safe and healthy. I request all of you to strictly follow the standard operating procedures, the COVID guidelines to keep yourself fit and healthy. Please take care of yourself. We are the social element, and hence, for the prosperity and betterment of a society, we have to gather knowledge and wisdom. Education is the primary object which can provide us the basics. Therefore, the education should always be viewed from a holistic perspective. Today's discussion on the topic, Steps Towards Decolonizing Museums in a Time of Pandemic, Violence, and Other Ills, is a kind of holistic approach. The museum plays a crucial role in preserving local culture. With careful documentation and artifact preservation, a culture can be recorded and remembered regardless of its future. It can also be shared and understood by those from different cultural backgrounds. Museums gives us a chance to look into the past as well as the future, to see where we have been and where we might go. Without them, many important pieces of history would be lost or shielded from public view by private collectors. Museum educate people. The Cultural History Museum educate people, about how people of the past reacted to their environment and the effect of these reactions to our past, present, and future. In addition to educational activities, museums have a significant, though not always fully developed, role in cultural tourism. The role of cultural tourism is closely related to educational, although it varies from museum with different work profiles. Art, history, and local lore museums are traditionally attractive for both local and foreign tourists. Museums are working to make their museums reflect the diversity and the voice of the people within their collections and around them. Many museums have legacies rooted in colonialism. Their collections were from wealthy donors who benefited from empires. So the question of decolonization comes. Some museums are developing strategic plans to develop or redevelop their conceptions of their collection and auditing the institutions as a whole. Sonapur is a place with multilingual, tribal, and cultural vibrancy. To preserve the cultural history, legacy of the empires, and also to educate people about people and the society. Sonapur College has initiated a little approach to build a museum in its campus in the year 2003. Since then, we are trying to develop it. We are trying to incorporate the new concepts to our museum in the light of recent researches. Hope today's discourse on the topic will highlight on how we could implement the concept of decolonization in the museums by keeping the very concept of museum intact. I once again welcome you all for this interactive session. I express my sincere thanks to the Department of English, Sonapur College, for their initiatives and for choosing this topic for discussion. I wish the program a grand success. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your encouraging words. And now this is the time for the inauguration of our webinar. As we all know, we really feel privileged to have Professor Ratan Kumar De Sir, the VC of Central University of Jharkhand. He is with us, and before handing over the platform to him for the inauguration, I would like to introduce Professor Ratan Kumar De Sir to the August gathering. Welcome, sir, to our international webinar. I feel privileged to welcome Dr. Ratan Kumar De, Honorable VC Sir of Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi. At the outset, I express my heartfelt gratitude for your kind gesture for kindly allowing the Department of English, Sonapur College, to conduct the international webinar in association with the School for Study of Culture and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences of your university. Sir is an expert of applied chemistry. Having a long teaching experience of postgraduate students, as well as supervising PhD students, Sir has research interest in the area of biomedical polymers, aquatic chemistry, and development of biodegradable polymeric materials. Sir was the World Academy of Sciences postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Chemistry, State University of Campinas, Sao Paulo, Brazil. Sir's contribution in his own field is visualized through the large number of research papers published in peer-reviewed journals, his books, and many other research papers like this. Naming a few would be an injustice to his valuable work. I would like to request VC Sir to kindly inaugurate the webinar formally. It's over to VC Sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Dept, Honorable Principal of Sonapur College, Professor William of New Jersey City University, United States of America, Dr. Rabindranath Sarma, Head and Dean of School of Culture of Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi, all dignitaries present in the conference, and all participants. Good morning, good afternoon, all of you. Good morning to Professor William, United States of America. It is a rare privilege for me to get an opportunity to open this webinar on an international conference on steps towards decolonizing museums in a time of pandemic, violence, and other ills. It is a rare privilege, of course, for me, and that too in a auspicious day of that is called Teachers' Day in India, which we are observing today, paying tribute to Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, former President of India. And it is really because both coinciding on the same day, obviously it is a most honorable and rare privilege for me. I felt myself honored, most honored. And I came to know Sonapur College of Assam is a well-established college and a NAC accredited college. And obviously, the collaboration between the Sonapur College and our Central University of Jharkhand will further foster the research and academics, that I'm sure. And to give a little bit brief account of the Central University of Jharkhand, because already Professor Principal Dr. Devabrot already told everything about the Sonapur College. So I feel it is a good platform for me to little bit highlight about uh, our Central University of Jharkhand work culture and our vision. That will be an appropriate. I will not take more time, just 1-2 minutes. The Central University of Jharkhand established in the year 2009 and almost completed more than 10 years here. So here we started initially from 5 departments and now we have almost 23 departments. And engineering, science, culture, arts, liberal arts, so many departments are existing in the Central University of Jharkhand. And the faculty members of here we have also tribal and culture department. I think something is going.
It's echoing. Yes.
Your two systems are going on simultaneously, I think. So you are getting the echo.
Echo sound, I think.
Maybe two systems running together.
Is it okay now? Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes,
Hello.
yes, sir. It's okay
Yes,
now.
Is it okay now, sir?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So the Central University of Jharkhand, now with 23 department, we have engineering, we have sciences, we have liberal arts, music, you can say our culture department. Recently, we have our Center for Endangered Language also dedicated for the tribal and dedicated to this tribal and cultural departments. So all these center of excellence are slowly growing in our university. We established our permanent campus in Cherimanatu area in Ranchi. Ranchi is a very picturesque place. If you come to Ranchi, you will definitely see, you will enjoy it is just like Assam. I went to Assam, it is a very nice place to see. And once again, I want to go to that place. And just like Ranchi is a very picturesque with a lot of greenery. And you will, I'm sure Professor William will love to come to this place. And also the our principal sir will also love to come to this place. Yeah. And the collaboration that is initiated by both the institution, Sonapur College and our Central University of Jharkhand is surely going to foster with the strong faculty background and our motive to do the things, because both are well-grown, well-established institutions right now. So I must say this particular conference, international conference, is more glorified because of the presence of Professor William, who is a much more experienced person and a renowned academician in its own way. So this also makes me a lot of proud. So with these few words, I would like to declare the webinar open now. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your encouraging words, and we are also glad to know about the university. But I'll just say one sentence for your information, sir.
Yes, please.
Myself and William, sir, we were there in 2013 for 13 days in your university.
Oh, really? I don't know. Definitely during Professor Khanikor time. Yes.
Yeah.
But now you come, you will see it. We are shifted to new campus.
Yeah, we went there, but it was not fully accomplished.
Now it is well established. Please,
yes.
Once again inviting both of you and also the principal, our Dr. Devabrot, to come here.
Yes,
and obviously, because you are collaborating, you will be getting an opportunity to come. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, sir, thank you for your
Thank
encouraging
you.
words once again. Now it is the turn for the keynote address, and we know that the keynote address will be given by Professor Rabindranath Sarma. And before he begins his keynote address, I would like to introduce Sarma to our August gathering. Professor Rabindranath Sarma is a versatile academician, and he is a very down-to-earth personality. Sarma, you are a part of the whole endeavor, and a series of discussions since the last few days resulted in this today's grand occasion where so many great personalities are present. Dr. Rabindranath Sarma completed his master's and doctoral studies from Tezpur and Guwahati University respectively. He has completed NEA-CTF project from Tezpur University, UPE project from NEHU, and one UGC project from Guwahati University. Prior to joining in the Central University of Jharkhand, Sarma sir has served as a visiting faculty in Thailand in Silpakorn University. He was also a visiting professor in the University of Tartu, Estonia, Europe. A professor working for the preservation of indigenous culture, Sarma sir was the editorial assistant in Assamese Encyclopedia project in the 5th, 8th, and the 9th volumes. Out of so many publications, the latest book that wins the heart of the readers is Tradition, Identity, and Diversity, the Future of Indigenous Culture in a Globalized World. It is due to his contribution to the field of promoting tribal and human rights. The National Human Rights and Crime Control Bureau awarded him the Nelson Mandela Human Rights Award in 2019. Congratulations, Sarma sir. And I welcome you to our international webinar for the keynote address. Over to Sarma sir.
Thank you, Dr. Smita Madam. Honorable our Vice Chancellor Sir, Dr. Devabrot Khanikor, Principal of Sonapur College, Professor William Westerman of New Jersey City University, and my dear participants, friends, in this international webinar on steps towards decolonizing museums in a time of pandemic, violence, and other ills. It is already discussed that this today is an auspicious day for all of us, for the teaching fraternity and the people who are planning to be a teacher in future. So for all of us, and the topic which is chosen for this international webinar, this is also very much interesting because it is a kind of steps towards decolonizing museums in this present time, because now we are in a very critical and crucial stage uh, uh, due to corona problem. And as a student of culture, just I remember Professor Melfilce Herskovits, who said that culture is the man-made part of the environment, or environment makes the culture. And again, if we see as a student of folklore, we always trying to cope up with tradition and modernity. Both are going together, and in this stage, it just before 6 months, it was difficult for us to think. Madam Smita Mahanta Madam called me and asked about this program. I was very happy, and I had got a chance to become a collaborative work with a renowned college of Assam, that is Sonapur College, and which is situated in a very culturally rich place, because the Sonapur College, as I remember, that is which is situated in the Guwahati metro city itself. And again, if we see the composition of demographic composition of people, we found that this place is a multicultural, multilingual place where we can meet people from different ethnic groups together, and again we can think about the unity in diversity. And if we see about the decolonizing museum, then if we think about it, then the place itself is a cultural museum, and that is a life museum. Because of course, I have heard that Sonapur College have initiated a museum, and they have started the collection also. It is a very good idea, because this is a time to collect and archive our materials for the future generation, because we don't know what is coming near future. So from that angle, this is a very good idea, and I think principals of this college have taken a big initiative to start to introduce a museum in the Sonapur College. Again, as I remember, one person of that area, he is from the Khaloibari village. His name is Muralidhar Das, who have collected lots of folk material, and he makes his own house as a kind of personal museum. This is a very good idea, and I have observed in Thailand, in many villages in Thailand, I have observed they have collected and kept their age-old traditional material culture items, and they make their make a good museum, and which makes and helps their economy also. Because it is in Principal Sir's address, it is already mentioned about the cultural museum, and in this context, it is very important for us. And what I want to say, this Northeast India, which is a place, mingling place of different ethnic groups, and who is a living example of contact, togetherness, and commonness of different ethnic and racial groups. And even I remember one British person, his name is Ferrier Elwin, who didn't like to back after independence, and who was the in charge of Northeast, the then Northeast Frontier Agency. At present, it is Arunachal Pradesh, and he was the advisor of the then President Jawaharlal Nehru also. He said that don't try to keep a tribal group in museum. So that is a very remarkable statement. In this context, we can think about that revitalize our culture, tradition, and heritage, which can make us rich, and not only rich us, it makes our culture rich, our heritage rich, and later on, this may be the history for us also, living history for us also, and this will help us a lot. In this context, I like to mention one thing, that our university is, particularly my department, we have already started one folk museum. We have started the collection, and that we have taken help from different museums. One museum from Singapore, one museum from Thailand, and another archive, the literary archive of Estonia. So all those institutions are helping us, and we are planning, we have started to collect the material. We have, and again, our university is planning to establish a big university museum too. So in this way, we can think about preserving our age-old culture, tradition, and ethnic richness. So this way we can go. And again, if we see the richness of our folklore heritage, we have more than 500 ethnic groups in party only, not ethnic groups, only tribal groups are in all over India. And we can think about the tribal groups, non-tribal groups, and we can make a plan for making a natural museum for all of us. And if we see this during this Corona time, when we stopped moving from one place to another, we have observed that nature makes us itself a museum specimen, because immediately when we stop to use machinery things, almost 50%, then it helps us a lot to go back to nature. And in this way, we can think about the preserving our tradition, and we can go back to our nature too. So we have Professor William Westerman, all of us of Sonapur College and Central University of Jharkhand, and all our participants are eagerly waiting to listen from William Westerman. So now, in this point, I like to stop my speech, because we can do dialogue in later also. Both Sonapur College and Central University of Jharkhand, we can meet together also. But this is a rare opportunity to meet Professor William Westerman. And just I like to say about my two schools, School for the Study of Culture and School of Humanities and Social Science. Under the School for the Study of Culture, we have Department of Tribal Studies, Department of Contemporary and Tribal Customary Law, Department of Performing Arts, and we have one center, Center for Endangered Languages. And in other school, the School of Humanities and Social Science, we have Department of Politics and International Relations, and another department, Department of Public Relations. And just I like to share about our achievements, that our students, though we are very young, only 10 years old, but our students cleared UPSC final examination. Our students cleared Public Service Commission's examinations, and of all department students, more than 50 students have cleared UGC NET, and more than 10 students cleared UGC JRF examinations. So this is a achievement for my both school. So I like in future we'll meet again, and now we'll listen Professor William Westerman. In these few words, I like to conclude my speech, and handing over to Dr. Mridusmita Madam. Hand over.
Someone has the mic on. We are hearing some TV noise. Mridusmita? Mridusmita, unmute yourself.
Yes, sir. Unmuted. Thank you, Sarma, sir. Thank you for your encouraging words, and also that you have told about your university, and you have also told a lot. You have also told a lot about the about our college and our present location. You know a lot of things about us, sir.
Mridusmita, can I mute everyone once again?
Yeah, sir. Yes,
Just
sir. Sir, please
just
mute. Yeah.
hold it a second.
Yes, sir.
You unmute. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I have done. Thank you, Sarma sir. There was some, I think there was some problem from some mic. Yes, you have also told about your university, and everyone present here will definitely will like to know about that university. You have also told about our area, about the multicultural, indigenous location or the nature of our area. Thank you for your encouraging words, and we are eagerly waiting to listen from our resource person, Dr. William Westerman sir. Sir, I'm really happy to have you here with us today. And from in our platform, and as I could connect you to our college. Welcome, William Westerman, sir. So before again handing over the mic to Westerman, sir, I would like to say a few words regarding him. Personally, I have been not very regularly, but I am very familiar with Sir since 2013 when we were in Jharkhand University for a workshop, 13 days workshop. Sir did his PhD in folklore and folk life from University of Pennsylvania. He has devoted his life for the promotion of folk life and its artifacts. A teacher quite close to his students, Westerman is a minute observer of the nuances of life. Westerman's are late studies connected mainly with museums and applied anthropology. He has immensely worked in the area of refugee studies. It's a very special mode of studies, I think. Museums, sociology of culture, folk life, applied anthropology, and social justice. Regarding his professional life, Sir is presently working in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and coordinator of Ethnic and Immigration Studies at New Jersey City University. Previously, he taught at Princeton, Villanova, Gotcher, University of Pennsylvania, County McClay Honors College, and New Jersey Scholars Programs PhD. He was the former president of New Jersey Folklore Society and immigration of right activists. His association with the museum study has led him to be the former director, Drake House Museum and Cambodian American Heritage Museum, Chicago. He also curated exhibits at Museum of Chinese in America, National Museum of American Jewish History, Philadelphia Folklore Project, Philadelphia Museum of Art. Sir was also the former president, New Jersey Folklore Society, immigration right activist. So this is about, I think it's a very few word to describe Westerman, sir. I just want to add one sentence with it because with him, I also have conducted some field studies in some tribal villages in Jharkhand. So from experience that I have added this word that he is a very minute observer of the nuances of life. Because when we were there, Sir has written a very nice article on a Berber whom he met for him that means in Jharkhand. So from that time onwards that we know that how he observed life very minutely at the same time the folk life and the studies of anthropology. Welcome, sir, to our international webinar. Over to William, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the introductions, the warm introductions. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Seems like the audio is okay, good. I just want to begin by saying that the time that I spent at the Central University of Jharkhand, also my
rehearsal কৰিবলৈ লৈ যায় আগে আগে চাইকেলখন ঠেলি ঠেলি গৈ থাকে মই পিছে নিউয়াৰ টেয়াৰছলৈ যাওঁ গতিকে সেই দিনবোৰ কেতিয়াও স্মৰণীয় হৈ থাকিব দেউতাৰ চৰণতো এইসকল শিক্ষাগুৰু তাৰ ওপৰত আৰু ক'বই নোৱাৰে তেখেতসকলক প্ৰণাম জনাইছো আজি
মিউট কৰি দিয়ক নেকি স্যাৰ স্যাৰ
Yeah. I was very privileged to be able to visit Ranchi, visit the Central University of Jharkhand, but I haven't yet seen the new campus, so I'm eager to visit again. And I haven't been to Sonapur yet. I've been to Guwahati several times. In fact, I passed through very quickly very briefly in January of this year. And I had plans to go to the workshop in East Karbi Anglong, which unfortunately was shortened, and I wasn't able to make it to Dipu this visit. But I've been very fortunate to visit Imphal and Nagaland on a couple of occasions, and I'm really looking forward to coming back and collaborating. And I would like to thank Dr. Sarma and Dr. Mridusmita and Dr. Khanikor for this kind invitation to speak today. But also I hope that this is the beginning of future collaborations when we can work together. I have much to learn about the many cultures of Northeastern India, and much to learn about museum work and how to conduct museum work. And really, my talk today, I'm just very humbly offering some questions and some ideas to think about. I like to say that I hope I offer more questions than I offer answers at the moment. But with that in mind, let me begin the discussion. And I will also, at the end of my talk, I'll also post my email address in the chat so that if people have questions or want to continue the conversation or have comments, what I'm presenting today is very much a work in progress. And so I welcome your feedback. And so I will begin, and I understand that you can see me, but I can't see you right now because I'm going to be reading from my text. So how can I want to see how I can get a signal if...
you want to share something?
Sorry?
You want to share something, sir?
No, but I want to make sure that you can all hear me okay. And
yes, you are audible,
okay.
sir.
Okay, so
you
just
are
speak
audible,
up
yes.
if there are any issues, to speak up, because I'm going to be going to
Sure,
my
sir.
text.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
We live at a time when it seems that everyone, at least in academia and in the protests in the United States and worldwide against systemic racism and police violence, is talking about decolonizing, a sharp revival in the rhetoric of decolonization after almost 50 years from the national and international movements that were at work during the liberation of African and Southeast Asian countries in particular, at least nominally, from European and North American colonization. What had taken place, and the decolonization that had taken place in the Indian subcontinent in the 1940s. Sorry, somebody needs to be muted again.
Excuse me, sir. Nandeswar Deori, please unmute yourself. Nandeswar Deori.
Students are bhalore shikha dile he.
Nandeswar Deori, please unmute yourself.
Amar bharatborshot kiman upalobdhi kore koru
ami. Nandeswar Deori.
Etu besike upalobdhi kore aru
Nandeswar Deori.
দেশত শিক্ষকসকলক সকলোতকৈ বেছি প্ৰাধান্য দিয়া হয় আৰু সকলো
Nandeswar Deori, please mute yourself.
Mute.
Sir, please continue.
Okay.
Yeah. Mute korana. Yes, sir.
Of course, Northeast India is its own anomaly, as it did not partake in the national liberation in quite the same way as the Indian mainland. And of course, we also know that even though in much of the global South, there was a nominal end to colonialism, particularly in Africa, the colonial, extractive, and financial relationships with the industrialized powers of North America, Europe, and most recently China, and especially through multinational corporations, still continue with enormous financial and social benefits accumulating in the North and further widening global inequality at unprecedented levels. Nonetheless, everywhere in the academy, particularly in two of the fields where I work, folklore and museum studies, one encounters what has become the buzzword of the moment, decolonizing. Let's decolonize academia, let's decolonize our practice, let's even decolonize our epistemology, as if that mindset of Euro-American academic hegemony over to alternative ways of thinking and practice that challenge the power structure. Remembering that the great American abolitionist writer and activist Frederick Douglass famously said that power concedes nothing without a demand, there's no reason to believe with any optimism that this time will be any different. My talk today starts with the premise that in the fields of folklore and museology, we have internalized a practice and a mindset that can be considered colonial. And I believe this is more or less equally true in Northeast India as it is in the US, with of course some local variation based on our histories. This is characterized by the following beliefs, practices, and assumptions. 1, museums have a right to the ownership of cultural property, even out of context, for display to the public without a reciprocal responsibility to the cultures from which those artifacts came. 2, our knowledge is based on an extractive model, not unlike mining, but in this case to remove cultural heritage, whether tangible or intangible, for the enrichment of the academy, including museums and publics. 3, the Western way of classifying, being scientifically objective, decontextualizing, and objectifying in the name of science, is, if not the only way of undertaking investigation, certainly the most valuable. And 4, the theory of knowledge that is built up from these collections and that supports the generation of this knowledge comes from North American and Northern European scholars or from those colonial subject scholars who have been trained in those academies. So these are the 4 assumptions that I would like to challenge and challenge us to think about how to come up with an alternative practice that is an improvement upon that. The origins of the discipline of folklore were not as tied to the colonial project as was the origin of anthropology. The origin myth of European folklorists is that it originated in romantic nationalism, but that in itself presupposes that all manifestations of the academic discipline must have originated in Europe itself. Research into the history of American folkloristics, in fact, shows contested ideas among folklorist anthropologists about the sovereignty and continuation of indigenous cultures. So for the most part, American folklorists were often at the same time anthropologists. There really was no distinction 120, 140 years ago. And they were engaged in the colonial project of cultural genocide against indigenous Americans. In Europe, folklorists looked to collect the materials from the peasant classes as a way to justify nation building. There were alternatives, and there still are today. I'm currently doing research on another project on the work of Black American scholars in the 1920s and 1930s to collect survivor narratives of people who had been enslaved, narratives that were ignored by the white academic establishment well into the mid-20th century, and research that continues to be overlooked to this day. Even earlier, in the late 19th century, the ethnologist James Mooney was kicked off of a Native American Indian reservation by the US military for siding with and advocating for the natives against the US government. More recently, the practice of fieldwork as the extraction of texts, usually by white fieldworkers, from indigenous people or people of non-European ancestry has been called into question. Yet that same work, especially in the public sphere, has resulted in greater recognition of diversity and even the expanded notion of what counts as artistic practice, and has expanded the canon of what is highly valued art. But if we look at who sets the agenda, from exhibitions to curricula to funded research projects, the power to make decisions still rests at the very top. And subaltern communities rarely, if ever, have a say in setting the intellectual terms and frameworks for what or who gets studied. Who is the intellectual subject, who is the studied object, and who gets to decide which is imbalanced in every way. This is bad enough in academic anthropology, where training determines expertise and hence power. But in folklore, which prides itself in valuing the authority and voice of the people themselves from the bottom up, it is incongruous with our sense of ideal disciplinary practice, at least or at most in principle. What I am asking for is a new kind of practice, one that does not reaffirm old structures of authority and power, nor rely on essentialist practices of who should be entitled to speak or who should be entitled to do research and why. I'm starting, along with many others, to question how to practice the field equitably without an extraction model, condescension, or patronizing attitudes that assume that we have all the professional knowledge about our subjects, rather than building a model for this that is truly collaborative. I argue that in museums in particular, it is the work of museum educators, those who work with the public to interpret material that has been presented by the curators, that is central to this project. Indeed, I argue that the division between curators who are relatively well-funded and whose training is valued, and educators whose work is often thought of as an afterthought to bring in the community, and researchers who are out there in the field generating the intangible materials and collecting the artifacts for the museum's work, that relationship needs to be rethought. And the model of the division of labor within museums needs to be restructured. And I would suggest educators need to take a more important role, need to be given a more centralized role, and researchers need to think of their work in more collaborative formats. Without that, and collaborative with the community, that is, not just collaborative with other scholars. Without that, there will be a glass wall between those who are on display and those who have the full voice of authority in their work and presentation. Obviously, this is too big a topic to cover in one lecture, so I'm going to focus today on the question of representation in museums of violence and the particular pandemic at the current moment. Though this does not speak in particular to the issue of indigeneity, I believe it's a model that raises the parallel questions of who is the subject and who is the object. And then I ask us to think about where the focus is in museums in carrying out the vital work of presentation and interpretation to the public. I also want to start with an acknowledgement to Indigenous scholars and also a caveat for the current moment. As a discipline, I like to conceive of a discipline, and this is following the work of an anthropologist named Rena Letterman. I like the idea that a discipline is a body of ethics, that it is not just does not just consist of subject matter and methodology, but that it is determined by the ethical system and the moral system of what constitutes good work in that field. This was once described by an indigenous Peruvian folklorist in the 1940s as a spiritual attitude that we bring to our work. I think it is essential in the field of folklore that we pay attention to, that attention is paid to listening to the narratives and lived experience of those people whose knowledge and artistic production we are both translating for the wider public, but also incorporating into pedagogical practices that in turn strengthen the resources and the larger body politic of the community itself. In the case of the US, for example, this has taken the form of respect for the ex-slave narratives, virtually unique among the disciplines, and more recently, collaborative work that American linguists are doing to preserve languages in the face of language extinction. Texts are sacred, or put another way, there is much knowledge transmission in stories and narrative, either instead of or complementary with academic analysis. In the first manifestations of what has become known as indigenous research methodologies, developed primarily by indigenous scholars in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there is a repeated emphasis on learning and situating knowledge through narrative, not just through disembodied classification. The best of American folklore scholarship experience, the best of American folklore scholarship in my experience, which these indigenous scholar activists are not familiar with in this case, does just that. Our work also centers the lived experience of the people we are, for lack of a better term at the moment, studying. And this idea of centering and amplifying voices, which is in the best tradition of our work, is what is similarly called for by the Black Lives Matter movement. So our aims are congruent, but one problem for American folkloristics in particular, and anthropology more generally, is finding a body of theoretical support for that kind of methodology and ethics in an academy that is still dominated by positivism and so-called objective scholarship. The caveat that I would be remiss if I did not mention is that we are also at the same time living at a time of very strong and sometimes violent opposition to science, and not for the reasons of anti-colonialism, but arising from, in part, religious fundamentalisms and other belief systems that privilege rumor over science. This trend has been fed by US political leaders from Ronald Reagan onward, but reaching its apotheosis under the current disastrous scenario related to the coronavirus, questioning the validity of scientific and medical research and stoking the fire of belief systems that look to God-centered explanations for disease rather than pathogenic or environmental causes, or even, as we see very much in the United States now, dismissing such disease as a hoax perpetuated for political ends. So I want to be careful and remind those who are quick to dispense with the idea of academic or scientific authority altogether, particularly in museums. Many belief systems are derived specifically to justify bias and domination of some groups over others, to ignore science in the name of religion. Science is not perfect, and knowledge is put forth in museum settings and universities are not infallible and are also imbued with their own biases, but they are open to correction, and we need to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. The answer for me is in collaboration between Native communities and learned authorities and presentation to larger publics, not the nullification of knowledge or the search for knowledge, because that once had origins in extractive and colonial models. Let me now turn to the question of how museums deal with the taboo topic of violence, and I hope then bring that into the current question of how to represent pandemics. The question of violence has always been part of my professional experience with museums. My undergraduate bachelor's senior thesis research involved examining the blood-stained clothing in the Smithsonian Institution, which is depicted behind me, ripped from the bodies of people gunned down at Wounded Knee. I went on to become director of a historic house museum in New Jersey, whose original colonial residents owned 3 enslaved individuals. One woman was freed in the master's will when he died, while the 2 men who were enslaved were gifted to his sons for a period of 10 years after his death. And they were never acknowledged in the Historic House Museum when I took over. The house was named after the owners, and there was no acknowledgement of the enslaved laborers that had actually built the house. Then when I was director of the first US museum devoted to the history of the Cambodian genocide, the legacy, then after that, I was director of the first US museum devoted to the history of the Cambodian genocide. The legacy of violence has always been present in the work I do and the way that I view the world. Just before the quarantine and our first lockdown, I visited a massive exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I don't know if you can see the catalog here. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. An exhibit entitled Theater of Operations, The Gulf Wars, 1991 to 2011. I traveled with a colleague from our art department and some former students of mine that I teach in summer school who are about to graduate from high school. So they were about 17 years old. The exhibit contained 300 works of art from and about the first Gulf War, stemming from the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991, and the second Gulf War from the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and over the next 8 years. Many of the artists in the show were Iraqi or were from other countries in the region, including Lebanon, Palestine, and Kuwait. And their works address themes of catastrophe, violence, survival, and protest. So there certainly have been books looking at the war from the perspectives of Iraqis and the impact on museums and archaeological sites as a result of the Gulf War. In fact, there's a wonderful catalog about the looting of Iraqi cultural heritage sites during and after the US invasion. This was the first large-scale visual art exhibition around a conflict that we in the US who launched the wars know very little about and have surprisingly little exposure to, considering it was a war of the television age. And I mention this because for my high school students, who had been born on the eve of the 2003 invasion. This exhibit was a complete revelation. They had not even studied the wars in school. So picture this, they were born in 2002, 2003, right around the time that the US invaded Iraq. And 17 years later, they still had not studied this major world event, major national event in school. It remained completely taboo. So for them, and I'm sure many in their generation, this exhibit served as an introduction to a catastrophic period, not just for Iraq and Kuwait, but for Syria, where the war spread, and the millions of refugees who still seek protection in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Europe. For some of my adult university students, some of whom are veterans of military deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, or are married to veterans, the war is something they experienced, but also without the full knowledge of the reasons for their deployment, or the US entry into the wars, or the global political context in which those wars were waged. And absolutely, this is a question of colonialism and neo-colonialism, and one can argue that the invasion was for the purpose of the extraction of oil and continued extraction of oil from Iraq and other countries in the region. So this is very much an exhibit about colonialism in contemporary life, a topic that is really, in American discourse, practically non-existent. So for a museum to be taking on this topic was really remarkable and noteworthy. The exhibit explicitly asked about the arts in response to war, and implicitly asked what is the role of museums in response to wars. In this case, wars that were so distant from the United States that few civilians could grasp the texture of the conflict at the time. News was limited mostly to journalists embedded with the US Armed Forces. Only through the material culture and artwork can we begin to see, talk, and possibly understand the perspectives of Iraqis and others experiencing the war firsthand. 10 years later, or in the case of the first Gulf War in 1991, 30 years later, this leaves us to ask who else other than museums is fostering this conversation. It's not taking place in schools. It might be taking place in universities, but it's not taking place in secondary schools. Certainly not primary schools. So why aren't there museum and exhibit funding opportunities from the government or from private foundations to make sense of the war in both Iraq and Afghanistan, or even the decisions for and the protest against the wars for that matter? Now, this was not a pandemic for anyone who remained outside the theaters of operations. Yet the consensus is that at least 100,000 or more, 1 lakh or more Iraqi civilians were killed in the crisis as a result of the invasion. And public health scholars calculated in controversial articles that as many as 5 to 10 lakh were killed or were affected by the invasion. Millions suffered health consequences, and 5 million more were driven into exile from Iraq, with 2.7 million of those, or 27 lakh, still displaced as of 2019. Not to mention another 1.3 crore displaced Syrians, many of whom having been displaced by ISIS as well, an indirect result of the US invasion of Iraq. These are hard, difficult, painful topics to address, especially in museums which can be public forums for artifact-based reflection and dialogue. And history can be very painful to bring up in these kinds of circumstances. And this is true of ethnographic history and cultural history as well. Our leaders and the tourism industry portray and promote museums as leisure activities, occasionally as educational spaces, and to use the term of the governor of New York State, the legal term is attractive nuisances, seeing museums as a nuisance rather than as an opportunity for dialogue, discussion, and social change. Funding streams, comprised in the US of a mix of relatively low government funding offset by private philanthropy, are susceptible to the ideological constraints of the donors, and the reliance on admissions fees further circumscribes the willingness to tackle a topic or interpretation that challenges the political consensus. Similarly, challenging a politically dominant view can attract the ire of sectors of the public and set up a clash between revisionist academics and activists who have a potential interest in depicting textbook versions of history and culture. Now, how does this translate into the portrayal of the pandemic and disease? One survivor in an oral history interview that I read was quoted by saying, "I'm going to die. I was crying bitterly." As he was being taken away in the ambulance, he said, quote, "I was trying to get my last glance of the streets." But this is not from a COVID-19 survivor or oral history project. It actually comes from an Ebola project, and these are very few in number. Whose stories count, whose lives matter, are intertwined, not only in medicine, but in museums and in oral history. Although viruses do not discriminate, we do. Exposure, infection, and treatment are to a great extent culturally determined, as is the memorialization of those who have passed. The anthropologist and physician Paul Farmer has spent his career demonstrating that the impact of disease on human communities is social as much as physiological, that the process of keeping people excluded from healthcare and positive health outcomes is a matter of structural violence. It is the paradox of COVID that the reason it has attracted so much fear and reaction is because anyone can contract it, including wealthy people and those in the industrialized nations of the global north. Yet at the same time, even in those countries, the highest burden falls on people of African and Latin American descent, immigrants, indigenous people, and the urban poor. 4 lakh people die of malaria every year. Polio and cholera are still a threat, but COVID-19 is the pandemic because anyone can be affected, even outside of tropical zones, i.e. any of us and not them, or not you. We personalize the pandemic, and we see the threat of the pandemic only when it comes to the possibility of our door. Our experience of the pandemic depends on where we are and the response of our leaders, but also as we have quickly come to realize, on our social class, depends on our social class, our occupation, and our racial background. The new division of post-COVID labor is between those working from home, such as myself, those who are considered essential workers in the food supply chain and services, frontline responders, and those who have lost their employment altogether. I just heard, actually, this is anecdotal, but I just heard, for example, in the United States, that between 25 and 30% of white workers were able to transfer their work and work from home, and less than 10% of African American workers were able to do the same. What has been less visible and more common because of the quarantine is an alarming increase in domestic violence. Within the first 3 months of the quarantine in the US, there were already at least 4 peer-reviewed medical articles documenting this trend of increased domestic violence. Nor is the violence limited only to the domestic sphere. Murder rates are up, shooting is up, shooting incidents are up. So in the US, the pandemic reveals stark inequalities determining who gets treatment, who remains an essential worker, who has the ability to quarantine and to quarantine safely, and who has the access to health care. In short, who is more likely to die or survive. Globally, this is also true. One medical article writes specifically that, quote, "It should be of no surprise that epidemics and indeed pandemics are disproportionately violent to populations burdened by poverty, military occupation, discrimination, and institutionalized oppression," unquote. Pandemics are by definition violent. They do damage to the body, but they also inflict more damage on some bodies than others, frequently correlated with structural racism and structural oppression, whether the disease is malaria, AIDS, or COVID-19. We are already asking questions about life after COVID. Having respiratory transmission, of course, it is the only pandemic disease that has closed museums. HIV/AIDS, which has infected over 75 million people and claims just under 8 lakh lives per year, never closed any cultural institutions. Yet the interest in its oral history didn't begin until about 20 years after. The politics of who was initially infected and who is still likely to be infected, and the preponderance of cases in Africa all make it less likely to be the subject of museum exhibitions in the Northern Hemisphere. Polio took longer to appear in oral history projects in museums, perhaps because recording and the field of oral history were not so widely practiced when the vaccines were first discovered. And yet Americans I know are still shocked when I tell them that polio continues to exist in India, and that I have met personally young people in India who continue to suffer its aftereffects. The only evidence that I can find of oral history projects or exhibits around other epidemic illnesses, namely Ebola, tuberculosis, and malaria, the biggest killer of all, are in one project in the Center for Disease Control Museum at Emory University in the United States. And even then, the overwhelming number of people interviewed for those exhibits and those archives are healthcare providers, usually white. Why do we believe that the memories of surviving COVID are more noteworthy and more valuable than those who have survived malaria or Ebola? Pandemics are, we now know, intertwined with violence. The violent inequities in our society are laid bare by the coronavirus, but HIV/AIDS activists have been saying as much for decades. And I would say that in a way, this is a metaphor or an analogy for the issue of colonialism, that the perspective of peoples who were and cultures who were colonized has not taken the same interest in museums. Their artifacts, yes, the artifacts have been presented and preserved, but the narratives and the experience from the bottom up have been overlooked. So if we reframe museums as spaces for dialogue and contemplation around artifacts and texts, and doors are open to all surviving communities, then the world. Museums, when they reopen after the pandemic, will become places where the questions of who gets to tell the story, of whose stories get told and whose do not, and of how artifacts and texts can lead to empathy and connection will take form. The history and development of the museum was based on an emphasis on looking at someone's collection, private property in the form of fine arts, colonial wealth, or intellectual heritage in the case of ethnographic collections, often donated to museums by private collectors, posing as education and enlightenment, or even in the case of the first museum where I was director, when I came in, it was presented as nostalgia among local historical societies. The power and economic relations were summarized by what the art writer John Berger called the gaze, in which all power is held by the owner first, then the viewer. The artifact becomes a possession, and its content, when examined, is objectified by the viewer's eye. Although old paradigms are changing, there is still an element in most museums that we visitors enter as spectators, eyeing someone else's history, culture, objects of beauty, usually during our leisure time or typically during school hours. One thing that I've learned in my research is that in the United States, 3/4 of museum education budgets go to programming for primary and secondary school student visits. The exhibit, not the educational or public program, remains the focal point in most museums. How then does the exhibit become part of a entry points into the forum, which is the museum? This becomes part of a conceptual shift to reorient our actions from being spectators to being listeners, or more specifically, what I like to call radical listening, a form of empathetic listening and viewing experience from the inside as much as possible, not from the objectifying outside, listening to voices that are seldom heard, and asking questions about why power relationships are established and maintained in the ways that they are. This kind of work presents its own challenges for youth and adult audiences. If museums can become sites of reconciliation and healing, which my experience at the Cambodian National Museum in Chicago showed they most certainly can, then they can be places where people share stories across the social barriers that have kept them separated, whether in times of quarantine or times of colonial domination. Contextualizing what we have learned from the experience might be our most vital purpose of such exhibits and programming. This is especially so in light of current protests such as Black Lives Matter, and understanding that if we do want to make a better, healthier world after the economic crisis, and 6 months into the quarantine in the US at least, we still don't know how long or how deep that crisis is going to be, or how many people will lose their homes, or in the unique case of the United States, how many people will lose their health insurance, since our health insurance is more often than not tied up with our employment. Museums will be the place where those investigations of healthcare policy and the structural violence of disease can take place against the backdrop of epidemiology. And I think this transfers very well to the question of colonialism and the question of a true polyculturalism and tolerance for different societies, tribal societies, and diversity of societies in a much larger context. That museums, again, can be the place where those investigations of indigenous ways of thinking and expression, indigenous arts, healing practices, and knowledge can take place against larger historical and political backdrops. So this is a global problem. Black Lives Matter in Africa, as well as they matter in the Americas and Europe. Indigenous lives matter too, and are seldom discussed as such. Looking at the inequities in global healthcare can be, perhaps can only be, grasped by comparing the experience of an illness like COVID-19 and an illness like Ebola, which make the news, and HIV/AIDS and malaria, which seldom make the news in the West and are seldom discussed or presented in museums. Museums would also do well to take the unexpected turn of becoming forums for comparative politics, public policy, and sociology, which vastly expands their mission, their challenge, but also expands the reach that they can have within their communities. All of this will be the work of museum educators, as much, if not more, than curators. While curators and administrators can make the upper level decisions about what exhibits to program and how to fill them, the true liaisons between the public and the voice of the museum are the educators. Their work is still the facet of museum programming that typically gets the least emphasis and the fewest resources, and often the least opportunity to develop transformative programming on their own. Yet, if we want exhibits about any social ills, be they wars, pandemics, or colonialism and colonial domination, if we want those exhibits to go beyond nostalgia and to dig more deeply into questions of public health, susceptibility, inequality, multiculturalism, housing, employment, the variety of arts and narratives and languages, in short, the experience of life under global capitalism, it is the educators who will become the essential workers between the public and the museum management. Who decides what is safe and when for public consumption is one way in which curatorial and editorial power exerts itself. This exists alongside what cultural geographer Doreen Massey has called space-time compression, that time is speeding up even before social media and the digital revolution. It took over 60 years to begin to record narratives of Americans who had survived being enslaved, and another 40 years before that can be considered historical evidence. It took only 40 years or so to begin to record narratives from the survivors of the European Holocaust. In contrast, survivors of the Native American Holocaust were never recorded. And I can't speak to the situation of recordings of survivors of domination and the nationalization and incorporation of the northeastern states and kingdoms into what became the nation of India. The Cambodian genocide survivors that I worked with were being interviewed within 15 years of their genocide, and mostly among resettled refugee survivors in other countries, rather than survivors in the country itself, which took over a quarter century to begin a tribunal and a reconciliation commission. The exhibits were more open outside the country than inside the country where the genocide took place. And even those inside were not geared for local youth to learn their history, but were geared for coming from abroad. Rwandan survivors of the genocide in 1994 rather, were recorded even more quickly, just a few years after the genocide, with some artistic projects geared towards healing. 9/11 survivors and even Ebola survivors interviewed were interviewed within a few years after the events that they survived. So time is telescoping and getting shorter. And yet many of the genocides in the past and many of the result of colonialism have never been acknowledged by museums, and the points of view of the people who were colonized have still not become part of the official narratives. I'm not saying that all museums represent inherently violent acts of appropriation, possession, and authoritative domination. And I think, in fact, that can become a trap that will hinder the possibility for museums to reshape themselves into ethical and challenging public forums. Not only do we need the forums in the absence of other cultural and educational institutions, but the visual, oral, and textual interplay is unique to museums. The only places in our society where visual thinking can and does exist alongside the verbal and the contemplative. But the question of whose stories are being told and whose stories are being heard and how this takes place are central questions. So I would close by saying that the educational arm of the museum needs to be strengthened. Extracting artifacts and putting them on display, disembodied from their communities, is not enough. And I may even question whether it is ethically right to do so. The relationship between the communities being depicted, including the degree to which they want to share their cultures and the wider public, needs to be developed with greater care. Museums are in a state of transition, and there are tremendous opportunities in much of the world, from sites where private property and cultural riches are put on display to arenas in which questions of preservation and vital questions in history, culture, and aesthetics can be discussed in an open forum. But in order for that to work, those discussions can't be an afterthought. And the native voices that provide so much of the knowledge and wisdom, which are the museum's true riches, have to be amplified in their presentation, not silenced, sanitized, or packaged. If museums become places for exploration, there needs to be the format for the public to interact on a far deeper level with questions of culture and politics raised by the work of the museum. Only then can we truly begin to talk about and work towards decolonization of our minds and our cultural institutions. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Principal, sir, I think you will say something before we begin the question and answer sessions. Sir, you want to say something, I think? Sir, you are not audible.
Now it's okay, na? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So it's a nice presentation. Thank you so much, sir, taking the pain and accepting our invitation and enlightening us about the concept of the whole aspect. So I have nothing to say about on the very specific topic. I discussed with Dr. Midusmita Mohanta about the whole topic that let me know something about this one, about the topic, and she told me something, and I get something from both the sirs, and actually really I am enlightened with this piece. Hope the participants, they are also getting the input on the subject from our research persons. So I request the participants to raise their hands and put their questions on the topic, and Shah will definitely try to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Westerman sir, thank you for your insightful words. We have a few questions with us right now, 4 or 5. I think they will be asking questions, and we are getting very good feedback in the chat box. Sir, should I start with those questions, sir? Westerman sir, should I start?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yes, sir. So the first question that we have got, what immediate epistemological changes, in your opinion, are required for future of anthropological museum after pandemic?
I think much begins with research and how to conduct research, which can begin through dialogue between the communities, the indigenous communities that are being researched, and the scholars, and to try to have a more open dialogue about research methods that are more more synchronous with the aims, the values, and the ethics of the communities that are being researched. This, of course, includes the training of young researchers in these communities, so that research is not being conducted exclusively by outsiders. And one of the great things that I know about the institutions that I visited in Northeast India in particular is that many of you are involved in this kind of education of young people from these diverse communities, and I think that's absolutely essential. So the question of developing methodologies from the communities themselves, I would say I would, one hears the term from the bottom up. I just not necessarily like the images that some people are on the bottom and other people are on the top, but I mean research that is based from the communities itself, and methodological approaches that are in harmony with the values of the community. That needs to be written about, and those kinds of discussions about what constitutes different kinds of epistemology needs to take place more openly in the academy.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more question we have got. You talked about the healthcare policy. Sir, how can we connect museums with the healthcare policy, sir?
Oh, well, I think university museums are actually an ideal site for this. We tend to think of art museums, history museums, and ethnological museums, ethnographic museums. But university museums, I think, are uniquely positioned to be able to present research and to bring in fields and bring in scholars from those subjects that have not necessarily been part of many museums in the past. And so if you have a university that has any healthcare or health-oriented fields, health science or medicine, obviously, or nursing or dentistry, or if you're a constituent college in a university system in India that has a medical college as another constituent college, or a nursing school, having developing collaborative projects across disciplines and engaging in interdisciplinary work really provides that opportunity. It's very limited here. We do have a couple of medical museums, for example, in Baltimore, in the city of Baltimore, for example, there's the National Dental History Museum. So there are a few museums like that that are not based at universities. But again, universities are interdisciplinarity in universities is not taken full advantage of the way that it can be. And so I would say that, you know, developing exhibits across disciplines is a tremendous way to open up not only dialogues across disciplines, but dialogues about subject matter that are seldom placed in museums.
Thank you, sir. It's a new concept for us also. We did not know about this connection of healthcare facilities or healthcare in connection with the museums. So there is one question: how the museums in US is different from India?
Yeah, I've seen very few museums in India, but I've been struck by the fact that the resources seem to be, for many museums in India, the resources seem to be extremely limited. And it's very difficult to carry out this kind of work when resources are limited. So that's one challenge. Secondly, in some of the state museums that I visited, there is an emphasis on antiquities or on decontextualizing the artifacts and placing historic artifacts on view behind a case, but without necessarily having very active interpretation or discussion about what the artifacts mean, or even more importantly, how the artifacts are used or were used in their communities. So there might be a collection of jewelry, for example, or there might be a collection of costumes, which claim to represent the entire clothing of a tribe, without any particular detail or writing or interpretation about how those artifacts might have been used. Maybe they weren't worn all the time, or maybe they were used for specific purposes. So that kind of interpretation to bring the artifacts alive seems to be lagging behind in India, from where it is in the US. And I would say that even, for example, when I visited museums in Canada, the comparison between Canada and the US is quite striking to me. Canada is a country that puts a lot of resources into museum education interpretation, and every museum that I go to in Canada has a much more detailed and extensive interpretation. I just visited right before the lockdown, what's it called, the National History Museum of Canada in Ottawa, which has tremendous collection of Indigenous artwork and exhibits on Indigenous history, First Nations, it's called in Canada. And their interpretation is extraordinary. Their willingness to not be afraid of raising very controversial issues and pointing to examples of oppression in history or aspects of Canada's history that people might look back on and feel ashamed about. And that's even a big difference between Canada and the US in terms of their willingness to hold up a mirror and take a very hard look at their own history and their own culture. So I would say that just from the museums that I've seen in India, and I haven't seen that many, maybe probably about 15, 15 to 20, I would say. What I've seen tends to be artifact based, and the development into Indigenous cultural institution, a living institution that people can draw on as a resource and can use as a space for conversation and collaboration. I think that's work that's very much in the future. And so I love hearing about the Sonapur College Museum and the potential for a university museum at the Central University of Jharkhand. I mean, I think these are really great opportunities for the future, and I hope that they get the resources and the funding that they'll need to do that kind of work.
Thank you, sir. Your answers are actually arousing inquisitiveness with us. Sir, there is, I think it's a technical question connected with museology. What is your take on the debate around the ICOM? I think it is pronounced as ICOM. I don't know.
ICOM,
Yes, the ICOM definition of museum spurred last year advocating activities, activists curating like hashtag museums are not neutral movement.
Oh, that's such a great question because I actually was following that debate. My membership has lapsed in ICOM, but I continue to be on the mailing list of the of ICME, the what is it, International Council of Museums of Ethnography, which I think may actually have a different name now. I mean, I'm biased. I have to say that I'm biased because I very much see myself as a cultural activist. And I think that there definitely has to be room for museums to become more effective global citizens and more effective citizens within their own community. I wouldn't go so far as to say that museums have to have an activist orientation. I think there's plenty of space for diversity of approaches within museums. But I really welcome the debate, and was very excited, and I know some of the people that were really proponents of changing that definition and bringing in a much more activist orientation. I think there's a lot of work to be done in still building consensus around that, but I definitely see it as a positive thing. I mean, I definitely see myself as a cultural rights activist and museum activist, and I think if museums are going to stay relevant into the 21st century, first of all, they have to be involved in preservation, as Dr. Sarma said, and then even build on that further, and more than just preserving, which is a huge and vital task in itself, doing more to revitalize. And so we're not just preserving cultures that are going to die anyway, but we need to do everything we can within the realm of culture to ensure that the cultures themselves don't become museum artifacts, but become living resources for young people to grow up with bodies of wisdom and knowledge and the arts for a healthier survival.
Midismita, you unmute yourself. Midismita.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. We'll, sir, take up, I think, one more question.
I love the chat. I'm not able to keep up with the chat, so I hope that I can see. I hope that I'm able to follow that after. But I'm really loving the comments that I'm seeing in the margin.
Yes, sir. So there is a question, because of the pandemic, now financial resources will be likely diverted more towards science and technology research so as to avert future disasters like the current one. Does that mean researches for decolonizing museums and other cultural aspects be affected?
I mean, it shouldn't be a zero sum. It shouldn't be that we're the expression we use here that we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. I mean, there should be in civilized societies, there should be enough money for science as well as for the arts and culture. And I personally believe that funding can come from other sources. I'm concerned about inequities in terms of funding going to research pandemic diseases such as the coronavirus, and ignoring, we still have not eradicated tuberculosis. We still have not eradicated malaria. And even though we have a polio vaccine, we still haven't eradicated polio. So definitely an inequality in terms of which diseases get funding. And the resources are diverted away from some diseases and towards others. Museums and the cultural sector require considerably less funding than scientific research. And at least in the case of the United States, this is what, one of my, I don't think this is, I can't speak to India. In the United States, the amount of funding that goes for the military just dwarfs everything else. Including education. I mean, military is the largest, by far the largest expense in the United States. So rather than seeing the alternative, we take money from science to give to museums. I think we really need to examine, do we need to be spending that much money on the military? And then that also begs the question about the distribution of resources and taxation in the United States. So this becomes a more domestic policy discussion, but this is even more of a debate, I would say, in countries like Europe, or regions of the world like Europe, which had extensive funding of culture for decades through taxation and through relatively lower spending on military. And now with the development of full neoliberalism and free market economics, as European countries are dismantling their social welfare states in the name of austerity, their cultural resources and their cultural activities are subject to the kind of funding cuts that they're not accustomed to. So I think the important thing is to stress that culture is a human right, that education is a human right. And as such, museums and educational institutions serve vital functions that deserve as much funding as the sciences. So I don't know if I asked the question, but.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. May we have one or two questions more?
Sure.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, the next questions that I'm taking up here. One question is that I believe Indian museums encompasses the histories and stories of the indigenous people, and in my opinion, Western museums need reorientation to be more inclusive to accommodate the voices and stories of histories of the margins. What is your take on it, sir? That is the question.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And again, I've spent a lot of time in Canada, and it's really encouraging to me to see that Canada is becoming very advanced in this way, and the United States is following, but more slowly. So absolutely, more museums and discussion about the experience of the many indigenous nations that we had in this country and continue to have, but many have been, many were killed off during the genocide of westward expansion. And even, I think one of the things that's very healthy about the protest movement that's taking place in the US now is that there is we're beginning to have a much more open and frank discussions, not just about slavery, but also about what happened to African Americans in the United States between the 1870s and the 1960s. And much of that history, which is simply not well known by the white population, and in fact, not even that well known by many people in the Black population as well. So there's tremendous work to be done in the United States. And, I feel very strongly that I'm also called to do work in my own country to promote those kind of issues and take account and take responsibility for what we ourselves have done in our own country, and not just point the finger at other countries and say, you need to do more about this when we're falling short ourselves.
Thank you, sir. So there is a participant here who has written, I happen to be in El Paso, Texas, and was very much fascinated by a whole lot of museums there. The Museum of Art, that of History, and Holocaust Museum, differently designed and well organized. Many festivals like Chalk in Block, etc. are associated with these museums. Sir, would you like to reflect on it?
I've been to El Paso, but I haven't been to any of those museums, so I can't speak specifically to them. But it strikes me that the question is about innovative programming in museums, and this is, obviously this is an exciting thing, and there's a lot of room for museums to be very innovative. the question that I have, or the concern that I have, is who is that reaching? Are these innovative programs able to reach not only young people in the community, but adults in the community? I think education never stops, and I think museums have a vital role in adult education. And I'll tell you this story. I work with low income. So I teach in a university that is in a low income area. It's a public university, so many of our students are from low income families. And I also teach in a secondary school program in the summer. And I have students that have told me, students who range in age from 16 to 25, many of whom have told me they have never been to a museum in their life, that there's no money for class trips in schools, that school districts, if they have money for trips, will take their students to a baseball game instead of to a museum, but that there's no money for taking a bus and bringing students to a museum. And museums are expensive in this country because they're privately funded. And so many students have parents that can't afford to take the whole family. You know, and just to give you an example on some of the major museums in New York, Museum of Modern Art, American Museum of Natural History, they can cost $20 per person, which is what in terms of rupees? 1,400 rupees? Is that right? Yeah, it can cost about 1,400, 1,500 rupees per person to enter. Now, some of the museums have taken strides that they are free for New York City residents. But if you have a family, if you're a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, that's a lot of money for working class families to spend in one day for museum admission. So there has to be a way for these innovative museums and these innovative museum programs to be available and to be basically free for students, even if even if the school is paying. There has to be some way that's subsidized, that people can participate in these great programs. So I can't speak exactly to El Paso, but I can speak to other museums in other areas, and the innovation is there, but the public access might not be.
Thank you, sir. We are coming to the last question in our chat box. The question is, will you please enlighten on trend and impact of museum research?
That's a difficult question. It's a broad question. On the trend of museum research, I would say one of the issues in all the museums that I've worked in is that there's never enough time and there's never enough money to engage in research, insufficient research. And the way that the funding is done in the United States is you have to apply for a private grant to fund the research time of the person to go out and do that kind of research. So the trend is that there isn't enough time to do the work that needs to be done. And the impact depends on the attendance. And again, if I think I said before, if 3/4 of museum education budgets, which are small to begin with, are going to K through 12, primary and secondary school students, then the impact on adults is going to be very limited. I mean, people can walk through the exhibits and read the labels, but there are very few programs, really in-depth programs, that engage people in discussion.
Yes.
You know, I would love to see things, for example, while we're all in this kind of quarantine, I would love to see museums not just have online lectures, but have Zoom discussions, bring people together, bring classrooms together, and have students to discuss the issues. I mean, I would love to turn this around if you have time and ask, you know, what are the issues that you in the audience see are facing museums in India? What are the challenges right now for museums in especially in the Northeast, but throughout India.
Thank you, sir. One more question has come up, the last question.
These comments are, I just want to say these comments are really great. And I'd love to respond to them in writing or individually. So I hope that I can get the contact info.
That will be nice,
yeah, this is great.
Yes, sir. Sir, really, I have no words to say thank you, because we are overwhelmed by your presence, overwhelmed by your words and responses to the questions. I think we have got some formalities for thanking you personally and for all the persons that are present here, participants, VC sir, and as well as our keynote speaker. So I would like to hand over the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Dept Dekar, for the vote of thanks.
Can I say one thing before?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Nothing would make me happier than if this was the beginning of a collaboration between us all, and that I would love to place the resources that I have and my whatever knowledge I bring at your service. And if we can find out ways to work together, and when we can travel again, to have more exchange, nothing would make me more excited than to work with you on different projects in your area.
It's a pleasure for us, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I think I should over the microphone. I'm giving it to Dr. Dept Dekar for the vote of thanks. Dept.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Smita ma'am. Good evening, everyone. I, Dr. Dept Dekar, first of all offer my vote of thanks to Dr. Devabrot Khanikor, Principal of Sonapur College, not only for his welcome address, but also for his all-round support and guidance in organizing this webinar. The same also goes to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ratan Sir, for his kind approval in terms of collaboration, and also for being the inaugurator of this international webinar. Thirdly, I offer my heartfelt gratitude and thankfulness to Dr. Rabindranath Sarma for his kind initiative in collaborating with the Department of English Sonapur College, and also for his keynote address, which is an important aspect of the webinar. Next, I offer my gratitude to the most honored resource person of this webinar, Dr. William Westerman from New Jersey City University, for his very resourceful and enlightening deliberation on the topic. It was really a treat to our ears hearing you, sir. I also offer my vote of thanks to all the honorable participants making their presence in the webinar from different parts of the world. Last but not the least, thanks and gratitude are due to all those without whom organization of this webinar would not have been possible for us. Thank you all for making this webinar a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dept Dekar. I think Principal Sir will say something.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and on the Sonapur College Authority and the Sonapur College family, we extend our heartfelt thanks to everyone. And our collaboration with these two institutes, big institutes, that will continue. That will really, it is an honor for our college, the Sonapur College. So we shall try to keep our legacy in the coming days. Thank you so much. Thank you for your valuable questions you have put and answers. And the hope I request also on behalf of our research person, I request you to his research person. He has given his email ID and the chat box, and requested all the participants, if they have any queries, they can directly put their queries, their questions, their feedback to sir directly. I also request all the participants, if they have some queries and they have some feedback, directly they can to our respected resource person. Thank you so much, and thank you once again. With this, with this we, sir, will you speak something?
I'm very happy to attend this international conference, and it's very interactive. And of course, this is a very new experience for me because I used to study chemistry, science, all these things, but I enjoy it a lot, and that's why I seek total throughout the seminar. Thank you. But we'll definitely progress our collaboration. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Smita, you
yes, sir.
Should I close?
Hope to meet. Yeah. Yes, sir. Sir, hope to meet.
Yes.
Sir, namaskar from
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, and Dr. Williams, sir, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a tremendous opportunity for me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sir, we'll be in contact, sir. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Sarma, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you all.